Welcome to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available as podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. Last week, our nation marked the first-year anniversary of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and some say that the attack has little political or historical significance, but others say that it may just well have been, indeed, the opening salvo of America's second Civil War. Tonight on our broadcast, we have Dr. Stephen Marche, a Canadian novelist, essayist, and cultural commentator. He's the author of The Hunger of the Wolf, Love and the Mess We're In, and How Shakespeare Changed Everything. He currently writes 1,000 Words About Our Culture, which is a monthly column for Esquire magazine, in addition to opinion pieces for The Atlantic Monthly, New York Times Magazine, and Salon. His latest book is The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. Dr. Marche, thank you so much for making time to be with us this evening.
My pleasure to be with you.
I want to thank you, first of all, for writing this book, because it seems that thanks to books like yours that have just come out, the news media has, I think, for the first time, begun to really take seriously what we're experiencing now. They've finally begun using what we call, unfortunately, the F word, the fascism, and seriously talking about the possibility of civil war. How did you decide to write this book, and what was that journey like?
Well, I was sent by a Canadian magazine to cover the Trump inauguration in 2016, and that had a very kind of fall of Rome feel to it, that whole event. Like, there was, at one point I'm standing on a limousine trying to get a view of the crowd, and then the limousine set on fire. Or I'm walking with a group of, I guess, anarchists. I don't know what they were. But then I go away to get cigarettes because I'm freaking out, and suddenly they're all arrested and charged with felonies. And just brimming with tension, and the police really stuck in between, unclear of what their role is in this, in the violence between people, and just a lot of craziness, as well as the inauguration itself, which was not particularly positive. So, from that point, I was like, okay, America's in trouble. Let's see how trouble.
Right. Now, obviously, we didn't get here overnight, but how did we get here? As an observer of U.S. politics and someone who writes a lot about it, the U.S. has been through crises before, but how is this one different, and how did we get here?
Well, the exact point of origin is really hard to identify. Some people would argue the compromises made in the Constitution at the very beginning set up this crisis. Others would say, the failures of Reconstruction and the Civil War. You could give sort of grand historical answers of that kind. The more standard sociological observation of the moment is really that the far right in America started blossoming after 2008 with the economic crisis, the devaluation of home values, the end of the middle class American dream for tens of millions of Americans, and also the failure of the surge in Iraq and other foreign policy failures. So, to me, the point of origin is really hard to identify, but 2008 would be sort of what I would say is sort of the beginning point of a lot of the things that we see now. And, the reasons for the collapse are several. They're gone into the book. The hyperpartisanship, certainly the decline of faith in institutions of all kinds, not just political institutions, huge high levels of inequality, both vertical inequality and horizontal inequality, climate change, other factors, and then also just a tolerance for violence, really, which is growing and extremely troubling indeed.
How likely do you think it is that we may be plunged into civil war? And if so, how would this civil war be different from the last one?
Well, the expert consensus stands at about 67% for, to pass the threshold of 1,000 combatant deaths a year within 5 years. That seems pretty reasonable to me. But the nature of this conflict, like, this is not the first civil war with people in gray on one side, people in blue on another side. Battle lines and large-scale movements of troops. It's more, as I envision it, and frankly, as a lot of other people envision it too, it's more insurgent conflict, large amounts of violence, an attempt on the one hand to control the violence by the forces of order, and then the problem is that process, trying to control political violence, tends itself to lead to more violence. I mean, that's the nightmare that's been behind so many of America's counterinsurgency failures, is that the attempt to stop violence can in fact provoke it. So yeah, the conflict that I would see would be, a raging fire of political violence and the attempts by people to stop those fires.
Right. Now, certainly in the first Civil War, it was more of a regional conflict. You had one region of the U.S. fighting against another, even though there was ideologies on both sides. This one seems to be more like, as you point out in some of your articles in your book, neighbor against neighbor. Ideological rather than a regional conflict, which is even more frightening to contemplate.
Yeah. I mean, there are regional differences, like there are blue states and red states, and they're quite real. But, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that these struggles are happening in places like the Hudson Valley in, upstate New York. You have all these, New York media people moving out to the country and encountering, a red state right in their own backyards. The big marker of political division, like Democrat versus Republican, is density. It is it's almost the clearest marker of the distinction between them. So yeah, it's certainly much more complex from a geographical point of view than the first Civil War. Although that's also true in a lot of insurgent conflicts, like in Iraq and in Syria, where these groups are often intermingled and have moved into cities, and they have neighborhoods, but they're sort of all in each other's backyards, and so when the violence starts, it gets horrible quickly.
Now, before the first Civil War, and you write about this in your book, both sides were in a great deal of denial, both about how bad the situation was and the true cost of war. Can that be said about us today?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the first Civil War, not as they said at the time, not a single person expected it or intended it or wanted it. They just drifted into it. And in fact, that happens with a lot of conflicts. Like, that certainly happened with the First World War, for instance, or other really horrible things where they drift. They find them. They don't intend there to be massive bloodshed. It just goes that way. And yeah, I mean, I do think we're kind of in a similar situation insofar as nobody wants to see this coming. Nobody kind of believes it's coming, and yet we can all kind of feel it coming. And when you look at the trends, when you look at the political trends, they do tend that way. So yeah, I mean, this is not a book about inevitabilities. I mean, there are projections in it, but they're based on very solid models. But if nothing changes, I think America is headed towards large-scale political violence for sure.
Do you feel like the federal government, our federal government, is ready for this?
It's funny, but just yesterday, the Department of Justice announced a new domestic terrorism unit, which I actually take to be a very encouraging sign that they're taking that seriously. That said, I think even though I have a great deal of confidence in the FBI, and I think they're I would not bet against them in any contest. I think they have a long road ahead of them. I think getting white power movements, getting far-right militias out of police departments, out of the military, out of school boards is going it's going to be a generational effort. It's going to be like getting the mafia out of the NYPD. It's going to require that level of dedication. Now, they are very dedicated and they are very strong, but it's still going to be an enormous task.
Oh. Now, there's been a lot of talk about secession, not only from the far right, with figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Senator Ted Cruz, but also from history and political scholars. What are we talking about when we say secession? Who would secede, and is that a viable solution or not to this conflict?
Well, I mean, it is growing in popularity. Like, it's a majority of Trump voting Republicans are in favor of secession, but also, 41% of Biden voting Democrats are in favor of secession. I personally think it is one of the better case scenarios when it comes to the United States is a kind of reasonable divorce. I mean, when marriages get to the point that the United States is in, you sit the kids down and say, it's time to talk about breaking up. But that said, as you identified earlier, like these regions are like, Texas has Austin in it. Chicago has rural Illinois right next door. Hudson Valley is by no means a Democrat paradise. There are these are very interstitial, and then of course the legal and technical issues of secession, which are dealt with pretty extensively in the book, are quite difficult. Like there's sort of an idea out there that like it'll be Texans raising their rifles in the air saying, "Don't mess with Texas." Well, it's not like that at all. The U.S. Constitution makes it basically impossible to do, and the UN makes it just a lot more difficult after that as well. So, whereas on the other hand, I think America is going to face large political questions because violence is horrible. No one wants to live, really. I don't think anyone wants to live in a country where the peaceful transition of power is not possible, and where the government they don't consider themselves to be legitimately governed. So I think all options should be on the table, and maybe secession is one of them.
Now, you are Canadian. You live in Canada.
Yes.
How is this playing across the border? No doubt there's a great deal of concern because of our shared common border and economic ties between the two countries.
Yeah, I mean, I would say they transcend economic ties. I mean, I think of Canadian-U.S. relationship as a kinship relationship. I mean, I have my Trump-voting cousin in Seattle, and I've lived in America. I've worked in America. I've worked in America most of my life. I had a column at Esquire for 8 years. Americans are my friends and colleagues and so on. So it's more than just like it's going to be bad for us. It's also horrible on a human level for us to see it. I think Canada has always had a particular view of the United States. Like, we're very familiar with the United States, but we're also at a remove. We're at some distance. And so we can see it, I think, a bit clear, more. We can see it with a particular kind of clear vantage point, if you will. And I think that might be our role in history, is to be the kind of witness to America in that sense. But it's extremely troubling. It's like watching your big brother suddenly lose it. Suddenly go on a meth binge. It's horrible to watch.
Oh. Now, in one of your articles, you talk about if indeed this erupts into a insurgency situation, where the U.S. military is called upon to control a massive insurgency, you say, this is a really good point, that victory and defeat when it comes to controlling insurgency look very much the same. And so we see that, of course, in the case of the first Civil War, and others around the world. Can you talk about that and how some people look at oh well, the American military will solve it, they'll quell rebellion, but it's just not that easy.
No, I mean, the U.S. military Well, first of all, the U.S. military, specifically because of U.S. law, dealing with an insurgency would be extremely difficult. For not from a practical military point of view, the militias would not be competitive with the U.S. Marines. The U.S. Marines are the U.S. Marines. I mean, they could beat anybody, but they can certainly beat weekend warriors. But the legal problem of waging war against citizens, in Canada, and remember, my country's almost broken up twice in my lifetime, and we imposed martial law in 1970 when there was a terrorist outbreak. We have an Emergency Measures Act where essentially all civil liberties are suspended. That's not possible in the United States. And so, in effect, you have the U.S. military trying to wage war against people who are entitled to rights. And that's very, very problematic and very, very difficult. I mean, the book really delves into the technical issues of that, but it's the problem of trying to wage war against citizens who you also have to treat as with respect and under the law. And that's just a nightmare thing. The other thing is that counterinsurgency itself is almost impossible. There is no winning. The only winning strategy of counterinsurgency is not to play. But not everyone has the luxury of not playing. They would face. The problem is that anytime they tried to occupy anywhere in America, they would make themselves illegitimate on that basis, and that would lead to increases in violence. And that's what we saw in Iraq. That's what we saw in Syria. That's what we saw in Vietnam. That's what we saw with the French in Algeria, with the English in Burma. There is no real counterinsurgency strategy is in effect almost.
You wrote recently an article for Atlantic Monthly, and you talk about how many of America's elites, that is, particularly graduates of Ivy League institutions, which have a long history of, making up a significant portion of the power structure in this country, they've turned against the power structure, the very power structure they've depended upon. And I'm thinking you bring up Josh Hawley as one example. Can you talk about that?
Well, this is one of the more shocking things to me. I've been dealing with this for a long time, so it's pretty hard to shock me at this point. But when a man like Josh Hawley, educated at Stanford and Yale, raises his fist to encourage rioters who then endanger his own life, can any country survive having men like that in leadership? I'm not sure. When I think about someone like Mike Pompeo, Mike Pompeo was first in his class at West Point and went on to be editor of the Law Review at Harvard. It's hard to become president of the United States. It's harder to become editor of the Harvard Law Review, right? That is the elite among elite positions. And then for him to essentially contribute to the hollowing out of the State Department and the various Trump era minor forms of corruption that were engaged in, can a country survive when its elites? How can institutions survive when people who are that invested in it, when men of that caliber, will not support it, will not honor it? I don't see how.
In that same article, you describe Ivy League institutions as hubris factories. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, the amazing thing was, doing the research on counterinsurgency, I read Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest, which is this discussion of the Vietnam War, which was essentially how this class of experts from Harvard basically started the Bay of Pigs and then had all these calculations about the Vietnam War, which they were going to win. We're talking the most brilliant people in the world with the best educations and the most access to information, really making decisions that have no relationship to common sense. And where basic facts of the world were totally ignored. And then the extraordinary thing is that exactly the same process is repeated twice again. Is repeated once in Iraq, once in Afghanistan, and then once in Iraq. And that really leads to a question. Well, okay, what is the nature of these institutions that they are both given power on this? Like all their failures don't mean that Harvard people aren't still, don't still get prominence. Like they certainly do everywhere, and yet they continue failing. What is the structural reason behind that? And that was quite complex trying to figure that out. I mean, the Atlantic piece was about that, but it's also like trying to get at an understanding of the psychology of people like Hawley and Ted Cruz and Pompeo. Why would they act the way they do? Because the Canadian equivalent of that guy, like the guy who was first in his class at the Royal Military College and then went off to get a law degree and serve the country at high levels, you'd have to put a bullet in his head before he'd do any of that stuff. Like his faith in those institutions is total. His or her. Like I don't even know who that person is in Canada, but they are out. They would their loyalty to institutions is total. So it was trying to get at how that could be. Although the answer, I admit, it was really only partial. Like I'm still quite mystified. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's some things that just defy explanation, or at least with hindsight, perhaps we can look back and get a grasp of it. But I like the quotation that you made from LBJ, President Johnson, who is looking over the list of very qualified advisors, and he said, "Didn't any of these guys run for sheriff?"
Right. I know, and didn't any it's all very impressive people. Like, did any? I think it was actually his friend Sam Ryburn who said that to him. Who did any of these guys ever actually do practical politics? Right, like go out and meet people, and go out and solve somebody's water problem. Right, like things of that nature. And they haven't, obviously. Halverson had an amazing phrase. I'm not sure I remember it exactly, but it was like, brilliant decisions that defy all logic. Like that was that was his description of it. Like it was one after another of brilliant explanations for things that are just totally wrong on a very basic level.
Right. You also say something very, very significant. You said the response to January 6th riot is even more significant than the riot itself. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, all countries have breakdowns, right? Like, coming from Canada, as I said, our country nearly ended twice in my lifetime, and there's been martial law in living memory. So, these things happen. Like, the question is, how do you react to them, and how does the political class react to them? I mean, I found that scene where there was a moment of silence for the congressional police officer who died during the riots, and only half of the side turned up to commemorate him. I mean, again, shocking. Like, you have to, you're not willing to memorialize someone who literally died protecting your personal physical security and the security of your institutions to which you have devoted your life. That's more of a sign of breakdown than the riots themselves, for sure.
Now, you talked about, growing up in Canada, and I'm assuming you're referring to the uprising in Quebec and so forth, things that your nation has faced. Can you talk about that and what that was like growing up that way, and how did Canada deal with that and get over that trauma?
Well, I don't think we did. We were good British Empire. We basically shoved it all under a rug and pretended it hadn't happened. There was I remember the 1995 referendum where it came within 1 percentage point of Quebec separating. And, effectively, I think we had two responses. One was to pretend it didn't happen, and second of all, to give, in effect, a species of home rule to Quebec, where they really can do whatever they want, and there will be no objection from the federal government. And that comes for things that actually the rest of the country really doesn't like their language laws, which sometimes can be quite oppressive. Or recently they tried to banned facial coverings for Muslims, which is very antithetical to Canadian multiculturalism as found in the rest of the country. But, there was essentially no response from the federal government because we've essentially said, well, you're going to do what you want, and that's how we're going to deal with this. But as to how we've dealt with it psychologically, I'm afraid we'd need a therapist, because I think what we've done is just bury it under a big rock and hope that the whole thing goes away. No doubt it'll return in some repressed form, in some way as yet unknown.
Right. Now, I have a friend, a neighbor who's a pastor from a fairly liberal church, I guess you would say, and he and I were talking recently, and he said something that was very shocking but not surprising to me. He said, for the first time in my life, I'm contemplating buying a gun, just to protect my family if this thing goes south,
I know.
And other people are talking about, well, let's look at Canada. Maybe let's go on vacation there and scout out some property and see.
Yeah.
Have you talked to people in the United States who are, maybe really frightened about this?
Well, I did have a friend move here. She was in Charlottesville, and then the Nazis came. And she's Jewish, and so she moved, and then she moved to Brooklyn, and then she didn't like the COVID. She happened to be in Canada during the COVID response, and she was just like, you know what, I'm staying. And there are. There's not. That's anecdotal. Like I don't think there's a significant number of Americans moving here. I have had friends call me up and say, can you get me a place in Toronto? Like, that was when the border were closed, but like that has happened.
Do you have a spare? Do you have a spare room?
Well, that has literally that has been asked. It's a joke, but they weren't kidding when they asked.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, and then also things like friends with diabetic children who want us to buy diabetes medicine there and send it to them because, of course, it's like a fraction of the price here.
Do you? You've obviously talked to, did a lot of interviews for this book, a lot of research, interviewing a lot of people in the military and politics and so forth. Do you find that people have reason for hope, or do you feel like people are sort of resigned to whatever outcome happens?
I think people are, the experts that I took are definitely preparing for conflict. Like they don't really feel a lot of hope. But then again, hope is not their business, right? Their business is to prepare for catastrophes and to prepare for disasters that are coming and to predict things that are terrible things that could happen. I think the one hope that I'm pretty sure is there are reasons for hope, but the hope that I'm pretty sure is not worth pursuing is the idea that this is all going to work out by itself, right? That it's all gonna that it's all going to somehow, like, it's going to be like the 60s, and then the 60s are burned, but then after the 60s people kind of calm down. Like I don't that I don't think is going to happen. But Americans are amazing at reinvention, right? Like they are the country of political reinvention. They are the country of personal reinvention, of building things from the ground up, and I think they're being called to do that again. I think a lot of these institutions need to be rebuilt, and I think we also need to understand that the hope here is in institutions. It's not in culture. It's not in these ridiculous culture war battles. It's in institutions that give meaning, that give some shape to a national unity and provide occasions for national solidarity. And it's those institutions that are really prepared.
Right. In terms of possible solutions, what obviously it's something that we should have done yesterday, but what is there a set of solutions that we can, if we enacted quickly, that could help to head off the worst case scenarios?
Well, I think I do take encouragement from Biden putting up a Department of Justice, which he did yesterday, a special unit for the Department of Justice on domestic terrorism. I think that's good, and it's going to be a bit of a struggle, but I think I take a great deal of encouragement for that. I mean, I think the political questions that the United States faces now are really enormous political questions. They're not who gets elected. They're what do we want our institutions to look like. I think that Biden's debate around the filibuster right now is really a premonition of deeper debates that are going to be ongoing, and that are going to be about the structures of American power, about the nature of government, about the value of the Constitution and the way that the Constitution needs to be updated. Jefferson said that no Constitution should last longer than 19 years. It's been 240 years for the American Constitution. And it's no question a work of great genius. There's no debate about that. But it's also an antiquity. And it increasingly, it just no longer reflects the reality on the ground of the United States. So I think the questions that America faces are really structural and profound. They're not who gets elected in 2024. That's of less interest to me.
Yeah. You talk about one of your articles too about how nations go through, natural changes, metamorphoses, and democracies tend to have a tendency not to be destroyed from outside, but rather to commit suicide. And countries begin to break up into smaller countries. And there are more countries now, I think you quoted once, more countries now than there were in 1940, because of civil wars and so forth. So this is also a natural process. Should we be looking at that and come to terms with that?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think one thing that gets lost in this is that, because American politics is really so bitterly divided and it has become such a hate fest, both of these regions in the country, the blue state and the red state, actually have quite strong positive values that are in conflict, but they're not necessarily opposed to each other. They just have grown opposed to each other. I mean, I do wonder what would happen if, say, New York State could enact the kind of meaningful gun legislation and health care and more European-style reforms that it clearly wants, but which it can't really have because it's tied to the United States. And similarly, I kind of wonder how some southern states could enact the kind of, they feel very hampered by their connection with the federal government. And surely the point of America is to achieve a kind of, a politics, to achieve the politics that you desire. And if you can't do that in the federal system, there must be you have to find some other way, especially when violence is growing. It's not just that there are more countries since 1945. There are 3 times as many countries in the world as there were in 1945. And there are 60 separatist movements today in the world, which is a very large number of separatist movements. And I think a lot of them are going to happen. I think Scotland is going to separate. I think there are real political changes afoot. And I do wonder if America were starting over, would it look like it looks today? I don't know. I think it might. It would look quite different, really.
I think just watching this go on around me, I have lost so many good friends. All of a sudden, they're just gone from my life, and not because I said get out of here, I don't want to talk to you, but they just don't consider me a friend anymore. And it's not that I would say, oh, you have different beliefs than I do. You have different way of looking at politics than I do. I mean that's always been the case. But right. Now it's a matter of they're saying, and because of that, because you're different, I don't want anything to do with you. Why now all of a sudden? Are you telling me? Are you cutting me off when we've gotten along fine? And never really had any arguments. We just don't talk about politics. Now it's you got to get away from me. And I guess I trace that back to Trump and the fundamentalizing, I guess, of the far right, and just saying, if you're either my way or the highway, if you don't believe what I believe, then you're an enemy. And that's really shocking. It's the first time I've ever experienced that, in this country.
It's terrible, isn't it? I mean, one of the most terrible stats in the book to me is that cross partisan lines, like when they did this amazing study with the geolocation and phones, and so like Democrats going to Republican places for Thanksgiving or Republicans going to Democrats places for Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving dinners lasted an hour and a half less, which is an awful lot less to talk, right? At exactly the moment communication is necessary, right? I mean, I think part of it's like now the hyper-partisan line, like in terms of like marriage, in terms of people who hiring, is much, much stronger identity marker than race in the United States. Like people don't want Republicans don't want their children to marry Democrats. Democrats don't want their children to marry Republicans. Democrats don't hire Republicans. Republicans don't hire Democrats. And I think also there's something that's, is truly bipartisan, like it's not Trump, is that suddenly everything in life became political. Like I think when I was younger, when I was in politics was like debate club stuff from high school. It was for geeks. It was like a very small part of life, really, were political debates. Now politics is, not only this intense identity marker, but it affects like what cookies you buy, what chicken sandwiches you buy, every television show. Like nothing is outside of politics. Like it just swallowed everything. So that it, like, one of the reasons I think it's probably hard to talk to your friends is because there's less stuff to talk about that's not political, right? It's like basically I think what you can talk about that's not political anymore is when you're home cooking, how to cook something. But everything else became very, very political very quickly, and that's toxic. I think it really is toxic.
Right. Well, my wife and I recently attended a sports tournament league for our daughter, and we were among the few people wearing masks out of hundreds and hundreds of people. And this is really, really strange. But, I wasn't about to start a fight or anything. I was just minding my own business. And we walked in the door, and several people, looked over at us, said, "Well, here they come. You're the liberals."
Right.
When did wearing a mask mean that you were, a Democrat or,
Well, I had a friend in Wyoming. Who knew I was writing this book. And he's a lawyer in Wyoming. And he wrote to me that because he wanted to wear masks in a grocery store, he had to drive to Colorado to go to a grocery store.
Oh.
Because when he would go into a grocery store in Wyoming wearing a mask, people would attack. Like they would say things. They would say nasty things to him. So COVID is not, compared to the crises that are coming, COVID is not particularly difficult. Like compared to climate change, it's not a hard one really. So
it should be something that unites us.
Exactly.
Yeah, it should be something that unites us, and
and it doesn't.
Go ahead. Yeah. One of the frustrating things that I find as an American watching news is, listening to what these people on the far right are saying, and when the question comes to mind, when do we start using the word treason? When, obviously that's a very slippery slope when you start using that word, because it could be easily used against you. But certainly there is a legal definition, and hasn't the line been crossed?
Well, I mean, I think it was Alexander Dumas who said treason is just a matter of dates. I mean, as a Canadian, to me, you're all traitors to the crown. Like, you should just come back and swear loyalty to Queen Elizabeth, and all will be forgiven. You know what I mean? Like, there is a certain aspect of American life that is inherently, in pursuit of independence, which is where this debate between, and there are really fascinating cases about that in the early days, like the Whiskey Rebellion, and of course the early incipient Civil War. I mean, Ontario, like the province that I happen to be in now, I mean, the first huge population move here was Americans after the Revolution who didn't want to pay the tax rate that the new government imposed. That they found, because the British Empire immediately lowered its tax rate after the American Revolution, so they moved to Ontario, swore loyalty to the Queen again, and in order to get lower taxes. And so, like, there's a lot of confusing moments like that in American history where it's like, you know, and I mean, I think you see that quite clearly in the iconography around defeated Confederates, where, you know, are they traitors? They're not really like, in some technical sense, yes. And, you know, certainly there are people today who call Robert E. Lee a traitor, but, you know, for 100 years, he was definitely not put into that category, even though he absolutely committed treason, right? Like, on a technical level. So, you know, yeah, like, in America, the question of treason is always a good conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, I would love to continue our discussion, but I think we're going to have to end it here. We're talking to Dr. Stephen Marche, author of The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. Oh, I had one more question for you, if you don't mind. The title, Dispatches from the American Future, is interesting. Can you talk about how that reflects what's in your book? How is the book organized? It was an interesting title.
Well, I based it on The Day After, which you might remember was a TV miniseries. Like, the model was The Day After, which was a TV miniseries based on a piece of fiction that was actually written for the U.S. Congress on what a nuclear attack would look like in Lawrence, Kansas, and sort of use the science to create a sort of picture of that eventuality. And so that's very much what I'm trying to do here. I imagine scenarios: a conflict with a sheriff, a presidential assassination, a hurricane hitting New York, an occupying force taking over American cities, and then I use evidence. Like, I mean, it's very deeply researched, about 200 interviews. I use the best available models to sort of to sort of show why that's likely and why that's plausible. And so it's this kind of balance between, I mean, we're calling it speculative nonfiction. It's a balance between, you know, projection and what is actually happening to get to kind of get a clearer picture.
Right. Well, very interesting book, a very important and timely book, and I want to thank you so much for making time to talk with us. Your book just came out, and it's available on Amazon and other online booksellers, as well as other bookstores.
Anywhere you buy books, it is there.
That's great. Well, good luck to you, and thank you so much again. Thank you for joining us, and those of you listening, thank you for joining us. And this is Pastor S.J. Munson signing off.
Thank you very much for having me.